Chapter 9. The tower rose faster than I thought possible. I'd watched Noah build the ark over decades, one man and his family hauling timber through years of mockery and silence. This was different. Thousands of hands working in concert, speaking one language, sharing one purpose. The bricks went up in rows that multiplied daily, each layer wider and heavier than the last. The structure climbed toward the sky with a speed that reminded me of the pre-flood cities. That comparison should have warned me sooner. The plain of Shinar was flat and featureless, river clay stretching in every direction. No stone, no timber worth building with. But the humans had solved that problem the way they solved everything. They baked the clay into bricks and used tar for mortar. What they built was stronger than anything the earth had provided on its own. I'd been stationed near the plain since Noah's death, watching the gathering. Michael had reassigned me from the wider patrols, concentrating our forces around this settlement. The way you concentrate defenses around a breach in the wall. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. I could feel the spiritual pressure building over Shinar like heat before a storm. The fallen were here, not attacking, not probing our lines, just present, gathered in numbers I hadn't seen since the war before the flood. They watched the tower climb, and they were pleased. That alone told me this wasn't just a building project. At first I'd tried to see what the humans saw. A city growing on the plain. Cooperation, innovation. Families working together, sharing meals at the end of long days. Their children playing in the shadows of the rising walls. After the flood, after the violence and the drowning and the long silence of the water, wasn't this what God had wanted? Be fruitful, multiply. Fill the earth. But they weren't filling the earth. They were filling this plain, and the tower at its center wasn't a home or a storehouse or a temple for worship. I heard them talking about it the night the foundations were complete. A group of builders gathered near the base, firelight catching the fresh bricks, and their voices carried across the flat ground with a clarity that made me lean closer. "Come, let us build ourselves a city," a man near the fire said, "with a tower that reaches to the heavens." Others murmured agreement. But the next words were the ones that settled in my chest like a stone. "Let us make a name for ourselves," a woman said, "so that we will not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. Make a name for ourselves. Not for God, for themselves. Not to worship, or remember, or give thanks. To be known. To be permanent. To build their way up to the heavens and plant their flag there. As if the gap between earth and sky were a problem of engineering rather than a condition of the heart. And the fear underneath it, so that we will not be scattered. God had told them to fill the earth, to spread, to multiply, to go outward. And their response was to cling together, to refuse the scattering, to build a monument to their own unity, a fortress against what God had commanded. I thought about Cain building the first city after God made him a wanderer. The same impulse, the same defiance. I will not go where you send me. I will make my own place. But this was different from Cain. Cain had been one man, broken by his own violence, building shelter from a world that would no longer yield to him. This was a civilization. Thousands of people choosing collectively to reject God's design for them. Sin had gone from a single bite of fruit in a garden to an organized, unified architectural rebellion. Against the will of the God who had drowned the world, who had promised never to do it again. They knew about the flood. Their grandparents had survived it. And they were building anyway, stacking bricks against the sky, daring the God of the rainbow to do his worst. I found Hazel on the eastern perimeter. He looked better than the last time I'd seen him, when he'd walked away from me on the hillside after Noah's failure. The strain between us had eased without either of us addressing it. That happens between warriors. You fight beside someone long enough and the disagreements find their own level, settling into the bedrock of a friendship that outlasts any single argument. You've seen it, I said. The tower? Hazel looked toward the plain, where the structure was visible even from this distance. Hard to miss. Not the tower, I said. The fallen. Hazel's expression tightened. I've counted over 100 in the last 3 days, he said. They're not attacking. They're not even whispering. They're just watching. Celebrating, I said, though even I wasn't sure that was right. Waiting, Hazel said, and his voice made clear it mattered. There's a difference. He was right. The fallen weren't celebrating yet. They were waiting for the humans to finish what they'd started, because this wasn't a battle the fallen needed to fight. The humans were doing their work for them, building a monument to pride, a fortress against God's command, a collective declaration that humanity didn't need heaven's help and wouldn't accept heaven's direction. This is what they've been working toward, Hazel said quietly. Not the violence, not the corruption. This, a world that doesn't need God. Humans who can reach the sky on their own. I watched the tower climb another course of bricks. Workers hauled tar-up crude scaffolding, their shouts and songs carrying across the plain. They were happy. That was the part that unsettled me most. They weren't building out of desperation or fear. They were building with joy. The joy of a shared purpose, of collective achievement, of proving to themselves and each other that they were enough. What do we do? I asked. We wait, Hazel said. Like them. The tower grew for weeks. I patrolled. I fought occasional skirmishes at the perimeter. Fallen angels testing our lines with a laziness that told me they didn't care about winning. The real battle was happening in brick and tar, and they knew it. I watched families move into the lower levels of the city. Merchants setting up stalls. Children running through streets that were barely finished. The whole settlement had the energy of a place that believes it's building the future. Everyone spoke the same language. Everyone understood each other. And that unity, that gift God had preserved through the flood, had become the tool they used to build their monument to independence. Michael appeared on the 32nd day. I hadn't seen him since the assignment to Noah, and his presence on the plain told me this was ending. Archangels don't come for routine operations. Report, Michael said, his eyes still on the tower. The tower is over 60 cubits, I said. The city around it houses thousands. The fallen have gathered but aren't engaging. The humans are unified. One language, one purpose. I paused. One rebellion. Michael looked at the tower. His face gave nothing away. God has seen it, Michael said. Those words had a weight I recognized. The last time I'd heard them, it was about the wickedness before the flood. Every inclination, only evil continually. God has seen it. My chest tightened. What are the orders? I asked. He said, if as one people speaking one language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. I turned that over. Nothing will be impossible. God wasn't angry the way he'd been before the flood. This was different. This was God looking at humanity's unified potential and seeing where it led. Not violence this time, ambition. The capacity to build and build and build, to reach higher and farther, to close the gap between earth and heaven through sheer collective will. And that would destroy them. Not through judgment, through success. If they could do anything, they would do everything, and the everything would include horrors that made the pre-flood world look gentle. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, Michael said, quoting God's words, so they will not understand each other. Not a flood, not fire, Not death. Confusion. The simplest, strangest, most merciful judgment I'd ever heard. When? I asked, though part of me already knew. Now, Michael said, and turned toward the plain. The spiritual battle hit at the same moment the confusion fell. I felt it in the air first. A vibration that ran through everything, through the ground and the bricks and the bodies of every person on that plain. Not violent, not painful, but fundamental, like a string being cut that had held everything together since the beginning. The fallen attacked in the same instant, over 100 of them pouring out of the positions they'd held for weeks, driving toward the tower. I didn't understand their strategy at first. The humans were already confused. What was left to fight over? Then I realized they wanted the chaos. Wanted to turn confusion into violence. Wanted the disorientation to become rage. Wanted the people who couldn't understand each other to turn on each other instead of simply walking away. I drew my blade and met the first wave at the tower's base. The fighting was brutal and close, nothing like the grinding campaign before the flood or the underwater defense of the Ark. This was fast, furious, and everywhere at once. I fought beside angels I hadn't seen in years, warriors pulled from stations across the earth for this moment. The fallen hit us in waves, trying to break through to the humans. We held them back. The confusion did its work. Around us, the humans were falling apart. A man on the scaffolding shouted down to the workers below, and they stared up at him with blank faces. He shouted again, louder. The words that came out of his mouth were the same words he'd always used, but they landed as nonsense. The workers shouted back in a language he'd never heard. 3 more voices joined in, each speaking clearly, each utterly incomprehensible to the others. I drove back a fallen angel and turned to watch a family standing in the street. The husband spoke one tongue and the wife another, and their children cried because their parents' voices had become foreign. The husband grabbed his wife's arms. She pulled away, not in anger but in terror. He reached for her again. Different words now, slower, louder, as if volume could bridge what had been severed. It couldn't. A builder on the upper levels stopped mid-brick, trowel in hand, and looked at the man beside him. They'd been working together for weeks. They'd eaten meals together, told jokes, planned the next course of construction. Now they stood 3 feet apart and couldn't exchange a single word. The builder set down his trowel, picked up his tools, and walked down the scaffolding without looking back. Others followed, not all at once. The confusion spread unevenly. Clusters of people who could still understand each other found each other in the chaos, drawing together in small groups that looked at the larger crowd with suspicion and fear. Families who shared a tongue gathered their children and their belongings. Partnerships dissolved in a sentence. Neighbors became strangers. The fallen pressed harder. I fought 3 of them off a group of women who'd gathered their children near the city's edge, trying to make sense of what had happened. One of the fallen was a warrior I'd known from the garden period, and he fought with a fury that told me this mattered to them. They'd invested in this tower. They'd cultivated this rebellion for generations. And now God was dismantling it without a single death, without a drop of blood, without anything more dramatic than the sudden inability to say, "Pass me a brick and be understood." "This is your God's answer?" the fallen snarled between strikes. Confusion? Division? He tears them apart and calls it mercy. The words landed. I didn't answer them. I just fought. We held the line. The fallen couldn't turn confusion into slaughter, though they tried. The humans did what humans do when they're afraid and disoriented. They gathered what they could carry, and they left. Group by group, family by family, cluster by cluster. They walked away from the tower and the city and the plain of Shinar, heading in every direction, following rivers and ridgelines and the instinct that told them to put distance between themselves and what had just happened. The tower stood unfinished against the sky. Half-laid bricks, tar cooling in abandoned buckets, the scaffolding empty and swaying in the wind. Babel. They called it Babel, which means confusion. When the fighting ended, I stood in the emptying city and watched them go. They moved in clusters. Those who could still understand each other stayed together. The rest split along the new lines of language, dividing the way water divides around stone. Some went north, some south, others scattering east and west, filling the earth, at last, the way God had commanded. But not willingly, not joyfully, driven by the loss of the one thing that had held them together. I saw an old woman sitting alone near the base of the tower. Everyone around her had gone. She sat on a brick, her hands in her lap, and she was speaking quietly to herself. Or praying. I couldn't tell. Her language was one I hadn't heard before. And the sound of it, the first prayer in a new tongue, broke something in me. I went to Michael. He was surveying the plain from the eastern ridge, the same ridge where I'd stood with Hazel watching the bricks multiply. The city below was nearly empty now. Fires still burned. Animals wandered the streets. The tower cast its shadow over the abandoned construction site like a finger pointing at the sky it would never reach. Permission to follow the scattered groups, I said. The vulnerable ones. The elderly, the children, the ones who ended up alone. Michael looked at me. The pause lasted a long time. Longer than any tactical decision required. He studied my face with an attention that felt different from a commander evaluating a subordinate. I couldn't name what I saw in his expression. I still can't. Go, Michael said. Protect them, but their choices remain their own. I nodded. That was always the condition. Always the constraint. Protect what you can, fight what you must, and watch the rest happen without interfering. Kemuel, Michael said as I turned to leave. I stopped. He didn't say anything else for a moment. Then, report to me directly when you're done, not through channels, to me. I didn't understand why. I said yes and left. Hazel found me as I was heading toward the southern road, where the largest group of refugees had gone. It's over, Hazel said, and there was no triumph in it. The tower is over, I said. They're not. I let that sit between us. They've failed completely. Hazel looked at the abandoned city, at the empty scaffolding, at the scattering figures disappearing into the distance. Every attempt, the garden, the offerings, the laws after the flood. Now this. What's left? They can't even talk to each other. I watched a family moving along the road below us. Father, mother, 3 children. The youngest rode on the father's shoulders, too small to walk the distance ahead. They carried everything they owned on their backs. They spoke a language that hadn't existed yesterday. God told Noah's family to fill the earth, I said. They refused, gathered here instead, built a tower to keep themselves together. And now they're filling the earth anyway, scattered by the one thing they couldn't build their way past. You think this is mercy? Hazel asked. I thought about the flood, about the sealed door and the people beating on it, about the silence that had followed when the last hill went under. That was judgment without mercy. Everyone died. This time nobody died. God could have burned the tower, could have opened the ground beneath it, could have sent another flood, covenant or no. Instead, he changed their words. He broke the tool they'd used to rebel and scattered them to do what he'd asked them to do in the first place. I think it's both, I said. Judgment and mercy. I think with him it's always both. Hazel was quiet for a while. Below us, more groups moved along the roads. North, south, east, west. Languages I'd never heard carried on the wind. Fragments of conversation between people who were already forgetting what it had been like to be understood by everyone. The seed, Hazel said quietly, like he'd been thinking about it for a while. I looked at him. He hadn't mentioned the seed promise since before the flood. I wasn't sure he'd been paying attention. Shem's line, he said. They went east, most of them. If the seed is coming through Shem, then that's where you need to look. I know, I said, and I meant more than the words. So go, Hazel said, gruff and final, the way he said everything that mattered. I looked at my friend, at the warrior who'd fought beside me since before this world existed, who'd stood with me at Eden's gate. On the flooded earth, over Abel's body, and through the long grinding campaign that had cost us Haydel and Siriel and friends whose names I carry but haven't spoken here. Thank you, I said. Hazel looked uncomfortable. He wasn't built for sentiment. For what? For arguing with me, I said. For telling me to stop hoping when I needed to hear it. For not walking away permanently. I walked away once, Hazel said. Like that settled the matter. And you came back, I said. He shrugged, but his jaw was tight. Someone has to keep you honest, he said. I left him on the ridge and headed east. The world was different now, divided in a way it had never been. The unity God had preserved through the flood was broken. The pieces were spreading across the earth, each carrying its own tongue and its own version of the story. Some would remember the tower. Some would forget. Most would build new lives in new places, and their children would grow up speaking words that half the world couldn't understand. I didn't know what God was doing. That hadn't changed since the beginning, since the first moment I watched him shape a man from dust and couldn't understand why. But I'd been watching long enough now to know that he worked in ways I couldn't predict. The flood hadn't fixed the human heart. The tower hadn't reached heaven. But the seed promise was still alive, traced through a single blessed line in a world that had just been shattered into 100 tongues. Somewhere ahead of me, in the eastern settlements where Shem's descendants had gone, the thread continued. Thin, fragile, easy to miss if you didn't know where to look. I knew where to look. I didn't know it then. I didn't know about the man God would call out of Ur. A city built on this same plain, in the shadow of towers just like the one that stood empty behind me. I didn't know about the covenant that would narrow the promise from all humanity to one family, or the child that would be born to parents too old to bear children, or the altar on a mountain where a father would raise a knife over his only son and hear God say stop. I didn't know any of that. But he did. He'd known it since before the stars, since before the dust that became Adam, since before the breath that became life. And he was already working. The road stretched east, the sky was clear. And behind me, abandoned on the plain of Shinar, a tower pointed at a heaven it would never reach. But God wasn't in the tower. He never had been. He was ahead of me the way he'd always been. Out there in the scattered, broken, babbling world, walking among them even when they couldn't see him, even when they couldn't agree on his name. I still didn't understand.
Chapter Guild, Stories for Your Mind.